In the last video, I had explained that Egyptian leader Nasser became the hero of the Arab world. He had stood up to Britain and France, who had dominated the Middle East for so long. The Israelis also made gains. The speed of their victory over Egyptian forces in Gaza and Sinai had proved the Israeli Defense Force as the strongest army in the Middle East. The only losers of the Suez War were Britain and France. They had underestimated the Egyptians. They failed to regain control of the canal and overthrow Nasser. The long period of Anglo-French domination of the Arab world was ending. One of the main effects of the Suez Crisis was to make many Arab states more hostile to the West than ever. The Arabs became more willing to seek Soviet aid. The USSR began to assist the building of Aswan Dam and many other projects. However, Nasser was not a communist. He wanted Egypt and other Arab states to be neutral in this core world conflict. In 1964, the Palestinian Liberation Organization (PLO) had been formed by the Arab leaders with the aim to unite all Palestinians and win back lands which they had lost in 1948 and 49 to Israel. The first two Arab Summit conferences were held in 1964, one in January and the other in September. The third Arab Summit conference was held in Casablanca in Morocco, in which the Arabs drew up plans to attack on Israel. It was to be a staged plan. First, they would build up the armed forces of Jordan, Syria, Lebanon over the next 2 to 3 years, and then would go to war with Israel. They had to also realize that without full preparation, it was futile to go to war. So they began to prepare themselves for an offensive in 1967. In PLO, there was a militant group called Fatah, which had its bases in Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon that bordered Israel. In 1965, Fatah carried out its first raid on Israel and continued to carry out armed raids into Israel over the next few years. Israel retaliated by taking swift and harsh actions against Fatah. Among Fatah's leaders was a Palestinian engineer and political activist who would play a key role in the Middle Eastern affairs for the rest of the century and beyond. His full name was Muhammad Abdul Rahman Abdul Rauf Arafat al-Qudwa al-Husseini. To the world, he announced himself simply as Yasser Arafat. As a student, he had volunteered to fight in 1948, and in the Suez War, he had served in Gaza. The adoption of the kufiya headdress worn by Palestinians who fought the British in 1930s reinforced his warrior image. Arafat came across as a fighter. He would rather die his sword than betray their cause. In return, thousands of young Palestinians flocked to join Fatah. By the mid-1960s, Fatah was by far the best funded by the Arab countries of all the Palestinians' guerrilla groups. He believed that violence was the only solution to Palestinian cause. Nasser was more of a realist who believed that open warfare against the well-organized Israeli military force would do no good. In the end, though, Arafat got his war and Nasser was proved right as the Palestinians were left in an even worse plight than before. By 1967, the forces of Arab nations facing Israel were 50% larger in terms of manpower and 100% more tanks and aircrafts with the assistance from the USSR. By that time, the USA had taken the lead in providing backing to the Israelis in terms of arms and funds under the leadership of President Eisenhower and then Johnson. This US backing gave courage and feeling of security to the Israelis. In Iraq, a new government came to power in 1963, influenced by the ideas of Ba'ath Party in neighboring Syria. Supporters of Ba'ath Party believed in Arab independence and unity and were left-wing in outlook. They were prepared to cooperate with Egypt. In June 1967, their president Arif announced, "Our goal is clear: to wipe Israel off the map." In Syria, in February 1966, a new radical and aggressive government came to power which demanded revolutionary struggle against Israel and called for the liberation of Palestine. They supported PLO guerrillas. In Egypt, Nasser did not want war with Israel as he believed that the Arab states were not ready yet and that Israel had stronger military forces than all the neighboring Arab states combined. However, he wanted to remain the leader of the Arab world and the champion of Arab nationalism. Therefore, in November 1966, he signed a defense agreement with the Syrian government according to which if one state was attacked, the other would come to its defense. The Russians encouraged Egypt and Syria and kept up a flow of anti-Israel propaganda. They hinted that they would send help to Arabs in case of war with Israel. In March 1965, President Nasser declared, "We shall not enter Palestine with its soil covered in sand. We shall enter it with its soil saturated in blood." This statement was followed by a series of border incidents over the next 2 years as Arabs and Jews challenged each other's territorial claims. Several of Israel's military leaders were keen to provoke clashes with Syria so that they could retaliate forcefully and teach the Syrians a lesson. In April 1967, an Israeli tractor was shot at from behind the Syrian border. The Israeli Air Force retaliated by attacking Syrian gun positions. These were then intercepted by Syrian fighter planes, and in this dogfight, 6 Syrian planes were shot down, 2 of them over the Syrian capital Damascus. Some historians believe that this incident started the countdown to the Six-Day War in June 1967. During this time, the Russians saw an opportunity to expand their influence in the Middle East at a time when the USA was bogged down in the Vietnam War. The Arab eyes were on Nasser. He did not want war as he knew that Israeli forces were far superior to those of the Arab states, yet he had to respond because his leadership of the Arab world was being challenged. Also, Egypt had a defense agreement with Syria which compelled Nasser to go to war in case if Syria is attacked by Israel. On 16 May, he made his intentions clear, ordering the withdrawal of UNEF, United Nations Emergency Force, from the Sinai Peninsula. This UN force had patrolled the area since the 1965 war, acting as a buffer between Egypt and Israel. Their departure was marked by the arrival of the Egyptian army. On 22nd May, Nasser blocked the Gulf of Aqaba, a highly provocative action that effectively sealed off Israeli shipping from the Straits of Tiran. Israel interpreted this as a clear declaration of war and began to prepare accordingly. Nasser demanded that Israel should allow Palestinian refugees to return to Israel and that Israel should give up the land taken in 1948-49. He thought that Israel would give in and he could win a victory without a war. This did not happen. In Jordan, King Hussein wanted to avoid war and remain neutral if fighting broke out. But the population of Jordan, comprised of almost 50% Palestinians, demanded revenge for the disaster of 1948-49. Therefore, on May 30, King Hussein had to sign a mutual defense treaty with Egypt, and a force of Egyptian commandos was flown into Jordan. Also, the Soviet Union threatened retaliation if Egypt was attacked. Nevertheless, the US President Lyndon Johnson stood by Israel. On June 1, 1967, a new Israeli government was formed with Moshe Dayan, the hero of 1956 Sinai campaign, as defense minister, and 3 days later, the Israeli cabinet decided to go to war. At 7:45 a.m. on Monday, 5th June 1967, the Israelis launched an offensive of blitzkrieg dimensions. By lunchtime, the war was as good as won. Within 4 hours, the Israelis had destroyed the air forces of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. In a mere 6 days, Jerusalem and West Bank had been captured, and Israel seized the Golan Heights. The capture of Jerusalem was especially pleasing to the Israelis. Arabs' prestige had been shattered by the nature of their defeat, while the Israelis were in a stronger position than ever before. The Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza found themselves back under Israel's control. To many of the refugees, it was now clear that they could not rely on the Arab states to defeat Israel. Instead, they would turn to the PLO as their only chance of liberation. Of all the Arab countries, Nasser's Egypt had suffered the most. Its army had been crushed. It had lost vast land. The potentially remunerative Suez Canal remained closed. The Russians had been a disappointment to Nasser and had sent no help. To try to improve their relations with Egypt and Syria, the Russians now began to supply them with modern weapons. In November 1967, the UN Security Council passed the Resolution 242, which called for permanent peace based on the withdrawal of Israeli forces from the occupied territories in the recent conflict. and secondly, the respect for the right of every state in the area to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries free from the threats or acts of force. The resolution supported the Arabs on the issue of land and supported Israel on the issue of peace and security. The UN-led discussions with both parties had made little progress. Israel claimed that its occupation of Arab land gave it added security, while the Arabs insisted on Israelis' withdrawal as a first step to peace. The Six-Day War and the UN Resolution 242 marked a major turning point on the history of Palestinians. Divided between exile, crowded refugee camps, and a stateless life in the occupied territories made them believe that there was little chance of fellow Arabs coming to their rescue. If anything was to be done, they had to do it themselves.